Our next presentation is going to be Mark and Yochana. Mark is, he tries to be funny. Sometimes he succeeds. A lot of times it's just a crash and burn. That's okay. Where Yochana on the other side, she does a lot of voluntary work, coding with children. I think that is fantastic. So I'm looking forward to this presentation. Mark, I know you asked me to put a poll up real quick.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Here you go.
Get that poll going while we're kind of getting this going. Hi, so I'm Mark, and I'm here with Yochana, and we are program managers in the identity division at Microsoft. So we're responsible for Active Directory, Active Directory Federation Services, and Azure Active Directory. And we work with customers on their deployments of Azure Active Directory, and we take the learnings and feedback from those deployments and work it back into the product to make it easier and better for everybody else. So if we were in person, I would probably right now ask the audience to kind of raise their hands to say, of this topic of like application permissions and things of that nature, how comfortable are you with this like topic? So let me give you guys a quick 10 seconds here to vote in the poll that Justin just presented up there. Okay, so far everybody, so the choices are, we are aware of this and we are monitoring it. We are aware of it, but we are not monitoring it. What are you talking about? And oh no, should I be worried? And then I knew it was the cloud's fault all along. So only one person so far has picked, we are aware of this and we are monitoring it. And the majority of people have picked the third one, which is, what are you talking about? And oh no, should I be worried? So Yochana and I would like to apologize for what's about to happen to you in this talk, but hopefully you'll be glad we covered some stuff. So go ahead, Yochana, go to the next slide. So I'm going to kind of cover really quickly application consent and why you should care about this and some key permissions you should be looking for in your environment if you haven't already. And then Yochana's going to cover how do I investigate this and some best practices for you. So application consent, you probably have seen this on your mobile phone already, where you install an application and it asks you to get permissions to read your photos and your contacts because it wants to be able to add funny faces to it, and then you can send it to your contacts and things like that. So OAuth and OpenID Connect applications in the enterprise work in a very, very similar model. So to kind of help align you to those terms, the client application is the application could be a mobile, web, or background application that's going to be requesting access to the data on behalf of the user. And then we have the resource application, which is the application that is providing that data. So in the Azure AD Microsoft case, this is usually the Microsoft Graph. And then lastly, we have the permission, which is the ability for that client application to be able to do something. So this screenshot here is an application consent dialog box. And you can see that the application here is the Contoso test application. And it's asking to be able to read the user and shared contacts. Shared calendar is also sign in and read that profile as well. So this is some basic stuff. And now the person can accept this or they can decline that. So you can go to the next slide there, Yochana. So in terms of actual, like, what does this mean? That dialog box we just saw there is the consent prompt, and the active saying yes is the consent grant. So this is pretty much the same way as it works on your mobile phone. Now here's where it's going to get a little bit different from an enterprise perspective, because end users can consent to this dialog box as well. But administrators can also do this, and they may need to do this depending on the types of permissions that are being requested. So for example, if an application is asking for some very high level permissions, you wouldn't want end users to be able to consent to that. You want an admin to come in there and be able to say, yes, this application that's asking for the ability to read all mailboxes or maybe do directory read write all, we as administrators, we're okay with saying that this application can do this in our environment. The second one here is that when an admin consents to an application, they are consenting to it for all of the users in the organization. So to give you an example of this, the native iOS mail client, when you go to add your Exchange Online mailbox to it, it will prompt you for that dialog box that you just saw that says, can it read your mailbox and send mail and all those types of basic permissions. And you as administrators may say, you know what, this application's okay. We're going to consent to this application for all users that are in the organization. and any new person that adds this, goes to use this application, will not get that consent dialog box prompted to them. They'll just get right in. So you can do that as an admin. Okay, so there's two types of permissions. You can go to the next slide that applications can have. I don't want to talk too fast. Okay, delegated permissions. This is what we want our applications to be using. This requires for an application to work, the user has to be signed in and present. These are the types of application permissions that non-administrators can consent to. And the effective permissions is going to be the intersection of the user and what the application has been granted to. So what do I mean by that? So if an application is asking, let's say it's the best way to search for SharePoint. It's this amazing thing, and the application's asking for the permissions of SharePoint, read all, read every single SharePoint site. An administrator is going to have to consent to that application. And now when the end user goes to use that application, what they'll be able to search for is only the SharePoint sites that they already have access to. So you're not granting any more privileges to the end user because the application has high level of permissions. It's the intersection of both of those. And I have a nice, next slide will kind of show you that. The next one though is the application permissions. And these can run without a user being signed in or present, okay? So there's no intersection between a user. So whatever permissions that this application has been granted to, it can do without any user being signed in. So if an application here is asking for the ability to read, write all mailboxes or directory read, write all, that application has that ability to do that. And it's very, very powerful. So we want to make sure we understand what those application permissions are in your environment. So this next slide here is kind of a nice summary of what I just talked about here quickly. So again, we want to make sure we're using those delegated permission models for those mobile, web, or single page apps. And the permissions model here is the intersection of the user and the application. The users are not granted any more privileges just because the application has permissions like directory, read all, or something like that. But the application permissions, whatever we grant that to, that application has the ability to do. So we want to make sure we're really, really careful what those types of applications are and what those permissions we've granted to be able to do. Okay, so why should you care about this if you haven't started doing this today? I'm going to kind of set you up here. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So when you click consent grant, what actually happens in the directory? So in Azure AD, there's two parts. There's something called the app registrations, and there's a second part called the enterprise apps. So the app registrations is the definition of the application. So you can think of this as like the back of the house configuration of the application. Is this application a multi-tenant app? Is it going to be available for just Azure AD users, or is it going to be for Microsoft accounts as well? This is all the kind of configuration of the application. And then this enterprise app is going to have the representation of the application in the tenant, also called the service principal, and we'll get to that here in just a second. So to kind of give you an example, if Yochana and I work at a company and we make a timekeeping application, in our tenant, there will be a application registration for that timekeeping app. And then Yochana and I are going to use that application to keep track of our work. So we'll have a service principal in the enterprise's app for timekeeping. Now we're going to sell that to other people. So in their tenant, they will not have an app registration. They will have a service principal in the enterprise apps section of their tenant. So if you look at your tenant today, if you're using Office 365, you'll see a service principal for Exchange Online or Workday or Salesforce or anything like that. There will not be anything in app registrations. But if you have like a line of business application that you've moved to your tenant, you will see an app registration and an enterprise app for this. And this is really, really important to understand, because when you start to investigate this stuff, you need to know where you're going to need to be looking. You can go to the next slide, Yochana. So the service principal is really, really important, because that is the security principle for that application. I think we jumped one slide too far, but I can kind of talk to it. So the security principle, we're going forward. Give it a second here. Okay, so the security principle of an application is the application service principle is that actual security principle. So what do I mean by that? the service principal can be granted access to different things in the directory. So we already covered the two, the app-only permissions as well as the delegated permissions, but service principals can be on ACLs for Azure Key Vault. Service principals can have role assignments in the directory as well as in Azure, and service principals can be owners of things like groups, applications, and other service principals. So these can be very, very powerful things in your directory if you don't know what they have access to. All right, next slide. So why do you care about this? This whole thing about application permissions and what did I talk about? Why am I even talking about this? Because we're starting to see this as an evolved phishing threat. So instead of the old types of, I'm trying to get you to run this macro to do some stuff, they're now trying to get you to consent to an application that has permissions in your directory where it can do stuff. So here we see a couple samples. We've added this Excel file. We want you to run this. And now we get this permission dialog box. And it looks kind of okay. The Office 365 logo looks all right. It's a little weird. It wants to be able to read your contacts, read your profile, read your mail. That seems kind of normal. And if you keep digging in more, it wants to be able to read all of my OneNote notebooks. It wants to be able to read and write all of my mailbox settings. This is starting to get pretty privileged to be able to do this to my account. So if the attacker is able to get the user to consent to this attack, they are now granting that application those privileges with that user, because that user has the ability to read their mail. That user has the ability to open their notebooks. That user has the ability to create forwarding rules in their mailbox. And now that application with that user has the ability to do that. So when we talk about sustained persistence, and Johanna's going to talk about that here in a little bit, but your IR process needs to understand what just happened, because there's no footprint on that client, right? If that application is malicious and it made a bunch of email forwarding rules, you need to go check that mailbox when you're revoking this application that you realize what happened, because that's where the changes occurred. So even though if you kicked out that application, it still has the forwarding rules in place. Or even worse, if you got a global admin to consent to an application that had a lot of privileges like directory read write all, and it has that in there, it can do those directory read write all to your directory. So this is a very, very powerful permission. And if you're not sure here from an IR perspective what to look for, you may have think, oh, I've removed the application, I'm safe. You're not. You need to see what that application actually had the ability to do and what did it do in your directory. Okay. So next area, what are those permissions that hopefully I've scared you that you should be looking for in your environment? So let's go over some of the big ones. So any of the read write all is probably going to be over permissioned. Any of the people all, any of that stuff all is going to be something we want to investigate. And now just because an application has these permissions does not make it malicious. Okay, there's good reasons sometimes for applications to have these permissions. So let's say it's an e-discovery application. That application is going to need the ability to read all of the mail, right? Like that's part of its job, and be able to read all SharePoint sites. But we want to make sure we understand what are those applications that need these permissions, and as an organization, are we okay with this? So take a look at this after, and we're going to give you a script that's going to help you with this. But these are some of the ones we want to make sure we look at. Now there's some low key permissions you want to make sure you understand the impact of this too. So user read, checking my profile email, this is some basic stuff that any end user can consent to. And it's not dangerous, but we want to make sure you understand what's about to happen to you. Because we had a customer where some user was going to use this directory app and they consented to these permissions, and it wanted to be able to like read the gal, basically like read the gal, right? Like the profile pictures, the first name, last name, email, just like basic stuff that any user can consent to. And about 6 months later, one of their executives happened to be browsing some directory site, and they were very, very surprised to see their internal gal profile picture and their first name and their last name and their email address. And their first reaction was, we've been hacked. And they hadn't been hacked. Just some end user that had these permissions to be able to consent to an application that was asking for these permissions, they consented yes to that. And that application did exactly what it was said it was going to do, which was like build this like virtual directory or whatever. So just because the permissions are low from like a privilege perspective doesn't mean that it's okay in your environment. This is something that you want to think about from an organization. Like, are we okay with end users consenting to this? And with that, Johanna is going to talk about how do you actually find this in your environment.
So I'm going to talk to you about how to investigate these illicit consent grants. Okay, so how do you actually find these? So if you have a small number of applications within your environment, the first two options are fine. So you can search within the Office 365 portal under the Security and Compliance Center in the audit logs, and you're specifically looking for an activity which states, is admin content is set to true. And what this does is it indicates that a global admin has consented to access information on behalf of the organization. The next area is the Azure AD portal, and you can just go to Enterprise Apps, scroll into each Enterprise app and look at the permissions in each tab. But this isn't very good if you have a lot of applications. So if you have a lot more than just a few, you can run a PowerShell script, which the link is there. And this is also posted on GitHub. And what that does is it gives you an output in a CSV file of all your applications and all your permissions to go with it. Then also, if you've got Cloud App Security, you can query and audit all OAuth authorization activities, and this is fully exportable, so you can then investigate each application and permission. So this is an example of what the PowerShell script kind of gives you, and these are a few things that you should look for. So start off looking at anything that is high risk and applies to all user. So the user assigned count is all users. Specifically look for non-Microsoft apps with permissions that are quite high, and these should all be reviewed. Next, look at the high risk users tab. You definitely want to look at anything if anyone's got any access to very sensitive information like finance or HR information or any industry sensitive information. Also review permissions for each delegated app. We're specifically looking for what Mark said, things like read write or an all permission, which is maybe not quite necessary or appropriate for the application. Okay, and then a few other IOCs to just consider is try looking for apps that appear to be trying to blend into your organization. So is there a misspelt name that would easily be missed? Is it an O a zero? And look for activity that occurs outside of office hours or coming from odd locations. User behavior that is outside their normal daily activity. You know, do they normally access this application at 3 o'clock in the morning, or do they not? So just look for things like that. And also consider, if you have a known attack and you know the dates and times of that attack, have a look and see if any applications were either created or privileges were granted during those times, and start investigating those as well. Okay, so pretty big question. The first one is, does your incident response process cover this scenario? If it doesn't, then needs to be put in, and this is how you can do it. So first of all, you need to stop and remediate the consent grant attack, and there's a couple ways to do this. So you disable the malicious service principal and revoke OAuth consent grant with PowerShell. The PowerShell command is just there. Also revoke the service app role assignment within PowerShell, and disable the sign-in for the account. Now, most importantly, what you need to look for is anything that is a persistent mechanism for the attacker. So as Mark said, if the application has used its permissions to set up a mailbox forwarding, by deleting and disabling the service principal won't actually stop the mail forwarding because it's already been put in place. So that's another thing to check for, is those persistent mechanisms that the attacker will have used. Okay, and I'm going to go into some best practices to protect yourself from app consent attacks. So the first one is to set your policies. So you can do this in the Azure AD portal, and there's 3 options available. There's the extremes of both, so you can prohibit your users from consenting to anything at all, or you can allow your user to consent to everything. So either of the extremes are not our recommended approach. What we do recommend is that you allow users to consent to apps that are from verified publishers. And for selected apps, you can allow people to grant consent that for data you deem as safe or low impact to your business. Another option is, which is on the right, is for you to use Microsoft Cloud App Security. You can set up app permission policies, which will automatically revoke an app or use an app based on certain risk detections that are in your environment. So they're both methods that can be used. Okay, so the second one is the risk-based user step-up consent. So this is enabled by default. And what this does is when a risky request is detected, the request will be stepped up to require admin approval. So users and admins will see the warning, but the admin has the ability to approve, whereas the user doesn't. And when this happens, the event is in the audit logs. And as we know, audit logs are very useful if they are checked, and this can be pulled from the Azure AD portal. It's also a big indication that a user may have been phished within your organization, but actually you've picked up the attack, not from the phishing, but actually from the alerts in the audit logs based on an application. And during this process, you don't want people to be waiting for the admins to approve applications. So it's really important to have a process flow in your business for admins to accept these if they are deemed safe. Okay, and detecting risky OAuth apps. So there is a good, better, and best approach to detecting the OAuth apps. So the script that I mentioned earlier, that's a great place to start, and it's free, which we all like. It does require some manual work though. You've got to comb through a lot of logs if you've got a lot of applications. So the better approach is using Azure Monitor, and you can pull audit logs and set up alerts to automate the whole process for you. And the ideal option is to do some risky app hunting with CASB solutions such as MCAS. And you can use filters to find apps that are potentially very risky, where users may have underestimated the risk. And the fourth one is for developers to check your apps. A lot of them are overprivileged. We are putting permissions out all the time to make it more, easier, more granular for developers for those permissions. One common thing we are seeing is line of business apps is that devs are not following the least privileged best practice. This is certainly not a new problem, but we are encouraging developers to follow this best practice. We've got some resources there for you, and as Teams is becoming more and more popular, you want to make sure that your app can access only the teams they need with specific permissions. So we've got some developer guidelines there as well that can be followed. Okay, and if you're going to be doing things like user education on consent and what to look out for, it could be really good if you can highlight the report it here. So this reports suspicious apps to us. You can report them directly on the consent screen, or you can use MCAS. So that's a really good way to report it. And then the more people that report, we can also look into it and see if we need to block it or not. Okay, so the most important thing is the go-dos. So we would really like you to go and do an inventory of your applications and their permissions using one of the methods that we've discussed today. Automate threat response by implementing risk-based step-up consent. Educate your organization on consent tactics, so not just the SOC, but also users as well, that this is an ongoing threat. And educate your developers to ensure that they do follow best practice and are not using a directory rewrite all is an easy solution to make their apps work. Okay, and this is just a list of resources that we've got for you. Really good place to go for all of it. This is all be made available, so you'll be able to get these slides and get them. But thank you for listening, and we are both on the Slack channel.